At my retirement party, my son-in-law stood up in front of 80 guests and announced he'd already lined up a buyer for my family's marina. When I told him the property wasn't his to sell, he grabbed my arm and shoved me hard against the dock railing. I got my footing, looked him dead in the eye, and walked inside to make one phone call. By the following morning, when Reed saw who stepped out of that car at the end of my dock, the color drained out of his face completely. I want to start at the beginning, because nothing that happened that evening came out of nowhere. I'm 63 years old, spent 31 years as a structural engineer for Forsyth County up in North Carolina. Bridges, drainage systems, infrastructure that nobody notices until it fails. My wife Agnes and I raised our daughter Della out here on Lake Adger, in a house her grandfather built in 1961. When Agnes passed from ovarian cancer 12 years ago, the lake was the only thing that kept me moving forward, the sound of water at night, the way fog sits low over the cove on October mornings. The marina my father started in 1978, 12 slips, a dry storage lot, a bait shop that smells like every summer I ever knew. Cedar Cove Marina. Nothing fancy, but it was ours in the way that only the things built by hands you loved can ever really be yours. Della grew up knowing every inch of that dock. She could tie a bowline knot before she could braid her own hair. After Agnes died, she drove out from Charlotte on weekends to help me with inventory, to sit with me on the porch when I couldn't sleep. She was 20 years old and she was the strongest person I had ever known. Then she met Reed. She brought him to the marina 2 summers ago, a Saturday in July. He showed up in pressed khakis and leather loafers, which told me something right there. He was 35, a senior financial advisor at a firm in Charlotte, talked fast and smiled easy. He had that handshake that's just a little too firm, the kind that says I need you to believe in me. I smiled and shook it and didn't say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was, this man has never held a fishing rod in his life, and yet he is already looking at my dock like it's a line item on a balance sheet. The comments started small, they always do. Reed would walk the perimeter of the property with his phone out, and when I asked what he was looking at, he'd say something like, "Just appreciating what you've built, Lawrence." Once, during dinner, he mentioned that lakefront property values in this corridor had tripled in 8 years. Just making conversation, he said. Another time he asked whether I'd ever had the land formally assessed. For insurance purposes, he said. Della would catch my eye across the table and give me that little shrug, the one that meant please just be nice. So I was nice. I answered his questions carefully and kept the ones I was forming in the back of my mind to myself. They got engaged 14 months after they met. Della called me from Charlotte and I could hear how happy she was, so I told her I was happy too. I wasn't wrong to say it, I wanted to be happy for her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Reed saw in my daughter, Cedar Cove Marina, was somewhere in the picture. After the engagement, the pressure became more specific. Reed started talking about what he called optimization. The marina's location was premium, he'd say. 12 slips was underutilizing the frontage. Did I have a succession plan? Had I thought about what happens to the property if something happens to me? He framed every question as concern. He was very good at that. One evening last spring, he sat across from me at my kitchen table and laid out what he called a gift. He'd found a residential developer out of Asheville, Ridgeline Partners, who was interested in the Cedar Cove parcel. He had a number. I won't repeat the number here because the number isn't the point. The point is the way he said it, leaning forward with that smile, like he'd done me a tremendous favor by doing something I had never once asked him to do. I told him the property wasn't for sale. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when you've decided the other person simply doesn't understand the situation yet. That's understandable, he said, but you should at least hear them out, for Della's sake, for your grandchildren someday. I thought about Agnes then, about the way she'd sit on the dock in the evenings with her feet in the water, watching the herons come in low over the cove, about what she would say if she could see this man at her kitchen table, turning her family's home into a negotiation. Reed, I said, I appreciate the thought, but the answer is no. He left without much more conversation. On the drive back, he must have talked to Della, because she called me the next morning sounding worried. Dad, he's just trying to help. He thinks about our financial future. Maybe you could just hear them out. That was the moment I understood exactly what was happening, not because Della was part of any plan, but because she had started to hear his voice instead of her own. What Reed didn't know, what I had never told Della in any specific detail, was that 12 years ago, right after Agnes died, I'd sat down with my estate attorney and done something I should have done years earlier. I transferred Cedar Cove Marina and the surrounding parcel into a family trust, not primarily for tax reasons, though that was a benefit. The real reason was what had happened to my brother Len's property down in Catawba County when his ex-wife's lawyers spent 3 years trying to peel off a land parcel he'd inherited from our parents. I watched that happen and I never forgot it. The trust was structured simply. The property could be used, managed, and eventually inherited by direct blood descendants of Agnes and me. It could not be transferred, sold, or encumbered by marriage, by any spouse, in-law, or outside party, without unanimous consent of the named trustees, which was me and Len. If Della ever inherited it, her inheritance would be protected from any future legal proceedings involving a spouse. That was the whole point. I built that trust the same way I built bridges, accounting for the weight it might someday have to bear. Reed had no idea any of it existed. I called my attorney, Desmond, the week after that kitchen table conversation, explained the situation. He listened carefully, then said, "Lawrence, as long as that trust is intact and you're the trustee, nobody can touch that property without your signature and lens. Not Reed, not Della acting alone, not a developer. Nobody." Then he paused. "Keep this close for now." I kept it close, I watched, and I made sure every document was exactly where it needed to be. I retired from the county on the last Friday in September, 31 years. Della drove up from Charlotte for the party at the marina. We had 80 people on the dock and in the bait shop, old co-workers, the families of regular slip renters, my brother Len and his wife Ruth, neighbors I'd known since Agnes and I first moved out here. Someone strung lights along the railing. Someone else brought a sheet cake with blue icing that said "Smooth Waters Ahead." Reed was charming all evening. He worked the crowd the way he always did, asking the right questions and laughing at the right moments. I watched him the way I always watched him. He had 2 glasses of wine, then a third, and I noticed his tie come loose and his eyes get brighter in the way that usually meant he was feeling confident about something. After dark, he clinked a fork against his glass. He said nice things first, about how much I'd given to the county, how much Della loved me, how proud he was to be part of the family. People nodded and raised their drinks. Della was smiling. Then he said the other thing. "I know Lawrence will be thrilled to hear that we've been working on a little surprise for him. Della and I have been in talks with a development group out of Asheville, good people, and we think we found a way to turn this beautiful property into something that can fund Lawrence's retirement the way he truly deserves. No more worrying about slip fees and bait inventory. We've got a real offer on the table, and we're expecting to have paperwork signed before the end of the year." The dock went quiet. I set my glass down on the railing. I don't know what expression was on my face in that moment. I know what was happening inside me, a cold, specific kind of anger I'd learned to recognize over 3 decades of engineering work. The feeling I got when I found a structural problem someone had tried to hide. Not hot anger, just a clear understanding that something had been wrong for a long time, and I was finally looking directly at it. "Reed," I said, keeping my voice level, "that's not accurate." He pivoted toward me with the smile still in place. "Lawrence, I know it's a surprise. That's why we waited until tonight." "There's no offer on the table," I said, "and this property is not for sale." He laughed, the way you laugh when a child has misunderstood something simple. "Let's talk about this after the party." "There's nothing to talk about after the party," I said. "There was nothing to talk about before it either." "The answer is no, Reed. It has always been no." The laugh faded. I watched his jaw tighten. He'd been building toward this moment for 2 years, and he'd made himself a promise in front of 80 people, and now the floor was coming out from under it. "Lawrence," his voice dropped, "you need to think about Della's future. You need to think about what happens to this property when you're gone. You are not going to live forever, and this dock is not going to maintain itself." "I know I won't live forever," I said. "I've been aware of that since I buried my wife. The answer is still no." His face changed. The charm dropped the way a mask drops when the string breaks. He stepped toward me, close enough that I could smell the wine. "You stubborn old man." His voice was low, but the people nearest us heard every word. "I've got a signed letter of intent from Ridgeline Partners already. Della co-signed as a family representative. This is happening whether you—" He grabbed my forearm and shoved. I stumbled back against the dock railing. The wood caught me across the small of my back. Someone behind me gasped. I heard Della say his name, sharp and frightened, the way you say a name when you see something you cannot take back. I straightened up. My back ached where the railing had caught me. I looked out at the crowd of faces, people I'd worked beside for decades, neighbors who'd known Agnes, friends who'd helped me keep this place going after she was gone. And then I looked at my daughter. What I saw in her face stopped my breath for just a moment. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't anger at me. It was fear of him. The quiet, specific kind of fear that has been building for a long time before anyone names it out loud. "I'm going to step inside for a moment," I said to the room. I walked off the dock. Behind me I could hear Reed's voice rising, explaining, recalibrating, telling people around him it was a misunderstanding. The louder he got, the further I walked. In the back office of the bait shop, the small room where Agnes used to do the monthly books, where her handwriting is still on the whiteboard under 3 layers of other notes, I sat down in her chair. I dialed Desmond. He answered on the second ring. "Lawrence, how's the party?" I told him everything, the announcement, the letter of intent, the shove. When I finished, there was a short silence. Reed signed a letter of intent to Ridgeline Partners and represented himself as authorized to do so on behalf of the trust. That's what he said. Another pause. Lawrence, if he submitted that letter with a forged authorization on a real estate transaction crossing county lines, that's potentially wire fraud. That's a federal matter. He paused once more. Can you be at the marina tomorrow morning at 9? I can. I'll bring the trust documents, and I'm going to make one call tonight. The call he made was to a former colleague who now worked with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission's Fraud Investigation Unit. I didn't learn that until morning, when Desmond arrived with two people I didn't know. A woman named Sandra, who showed me credentials and introduced herself as an investigator, and a younger man with a briefcase who let her do the talking. Della was already there. She'd spent the night in her old bedroom, and when I came downstairs at 7, she was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug, staring at the window. Reed had driven back to Charlotte alone the night before. She looked up at me. Dad, I need you to explain the trust, all of it, from the beginning. So I did. I sat down across from her at the same table where Reed had once laid out his plans and told me I should hear the developer out. I told her about the morning after Agnes's funeral when I'd called Desmond and said I need to make sure this place is protected. I told her about Len and the Catawba property. I told her exactly what the trust allowed and what it didn't. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said quietly, "He told me the letter of intent was a formality, that you'd verbally agreed in principle, that it just needed a signature to get things moving." I told him no, I said, clearly, in this kitchen. She nodded once. "He told me you'd said you were open to it." I watched her face as she worked through the arithmetic of those two things. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. When Desmond arrived with the investigators, we spread everything across the dining table. The trust documents were clean and specific. The letter of intent Reed had submitted to Ridgeline Partners named him as authorized trustee representative of the Cedar Cove Family Trust, a designation that did not exist and had never been granted to him. There was a family authorization section. The signature on it was Della's. She looked at it for a long time. "I signed something," she said finally. "He said it was a preliminary interest form, that it wasn't binding, that it just put us in the queue for an initial meeting." She turned the page toward me. Her voice was very steady. "That's my signature, but that's not what I thought I was signing." The investigator made a note. Desmond laid the trust document beside the letter of intent, side by side on the table. "The property cannot be encumbered by any transaction without the signatures of both trustees, Lawrence and Leonard. There is no valid transaction here. Ridgeline received a fraudulent letter of authorization. If they proceeded on that basis, they carry their own exposure, and the individual who submitted it carries significant personal liability." Reed arrived at 11. He pulled into the gravel lot in his BMW with the practiced ease of someone who'd worked out his explanation on the drive up. He'd changed into fresh clothes, which told me he'd spent the night on his approach. He came through the bait shop door with his hands out, already talking. He stopped when he saw Desmond. He stopped when he saw Sandra and her briefcase. He looked at Della last, and whatever was in her face made him look away fast. "Sit down, Reed," I said. He didn't sit. He looked at the documents on the table, and I watched the color leave his face. Desmond walked him through all of it. The trust structure, the letter of intent, the authorization section, what the investigators unit had found in their preliminary review of the submission to Ridgeline. Reed started talking, fast overlapping words, saying he'd been under the impression that I was amenable, that Della had confirmed it, that it was an honest miscommunication, that he could contact Ridgeline that afternoon and have the letter withdrawn, that no real harm had been done, that surely we could work this out as a family. The investigator let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Reed, the representation made in that letter was false. We'll need to go over that in detail, and I'd strongly recommend you speak with an attorney before we do." He sat down then. Not the way you sit down when you're choosing to. The way you sit down when something in your legs has stopped working. I looked at my son-in-law, 35 years old, MBA, expensive watch, a car he couldn't actually afford. And underneath all of it, a man who was about to lose his position at his firm, who owed money to people who were not patient, who had borrowed against a future he hadn't earned, and decided the fastest way out ran directly through my daughter's inheritance. "I don't wish you harm," I said to him. "I mean that. But you put your hands on me last night in front of the people I've known for 30 years. You used my daughter's signature on a document she didn't understand. You've been working on this for 2 years while calling me Lawrence and shaking my hand." I paused. "I hope you understand what that cost you." He didn't answer. Della filed for divorce 6 weeks later. What her attorneys found when they started examining the joint accounts didn't help Reed's position. He'd been quietly drawing money for over a year, paying off gambling debts Della had no knowledge of. His firm terminated him in November, a few weeks before the compliance investigation at his office concluded. We never heard from him after the divorce was finalized. Della came back to Cedar Cove for Thanksgiving, then Christmas. Then she kept coming back. By spring, she'd arranged a transfer to a regional office in Morganton, 20 minutes from the lake. She bought a small house in town and started keeping her kayak in slip number 7. On a Sunday evening in late April, we sat on the dock as the light was going gold over the water. A great blue heron was working the shallows near the point. The slips were full for the weekend. "I've been thinking about taking over some of the operations," Della said. "At least the summer bookings. You shouldn't be handling all of it alone." I looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know." She was quiet a moment, watching the heron. "Mom used to say this place had its own kind of gravity, that it pulled you back no matter where you went." She paused. She was right. We sat there until the heron moved on and the boats came in off the water for the evening. I thought about Agnes and about my father driving the first dock pilings into this lake bed with nothing but a rented auger and a plan drawn on the back of a grocery bag. I thought about the morning I called Desmond and said I need to make sure this place is protected, how I'd felt certain at the time that I was being responsible and maybe a little paranoid. I was right to be paranoid, but I was also lucky that I'd done the work before the weight arrived. The people who want to take things from you almost always come through someone you love. They borrow the trust you've spent a lifetime building, and they spend it like it belongs to them. And they count on you being too tired, or too polite, or too afraid of your daughter's unhappiness to stop them. Don't be too polite, don't wait. Build the foundation before the pressure comes, because the pressure always comes eventually. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been standing where I was standing, watching someone use your daughter to get to everything her mother helped build, what would you have done differently? Leave your answer in the comments below. And drop the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. I'll see you in the next one.